I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining in this final edition of the COVID Flash Talks, with this being the final week of teaching here, entitled Learning in Governance in Times of COVID-19. So my name is Maurice Kirschbaum. I'm a student in the MSc in Migration Studies, and I will moderate this talk with Tamoy Fuji, who is an MSc in Global Governance and Diplomacy. And for everyone joining for the first time, the COVID Flash Talks, it's a new initiative supported by ODID and COMPAS. That's the Oxford Department of International Development and the Center on Migration Policy and Society. And the aims of the talk is to create a space in which academic debate can be started around the current COVID-19 pandemic, with reference to issues which we are dealing with in the department, we're discussing in the department every day. And we're also taking this opportunity to feature work from younger researchers and students in conversation in this. And so for the structure of the talk today, we'll have the first 35 minutes where we'll have talk by Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, Mukta Naik, and Isabela Blumm, and they'll present their research and thoughts on our topic. And then we'll move into a Q&A, and we'll work to conclude the event around 3:10. And if you see the function in Zoom, there's a Q&A function, and if you can let us know all your questions through that, that's where we'll be taking the questions from and reading them aloud as well. But now, without further ado, and to get started, I'll just quickly introduce our three guests today in the order in which they'll present. Jomo Kwame Sundaram is an economist and an expert in the political economy of development, specializing in Southeast Asia. He's a prominent academic and served as the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development from 2005 to 2012. And then as an Assistant Director General on Coordination for Economic and Social Development at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO in Rome, from 2012 to 2015. And after leaving the UN system in 2015, he's since returned to academia, previously holding, amongst others, the chair for international studies at the Institute for Strategic Studies in Kuala Lumpur. And our second speaker will be Mukta Naik, an architect and urban planner. She's a fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, and her research interests include housing and urban poverty, urban informality and internal migration, as well as urban transformation in small cities. She focuses on understanding the links between internal migration and urbanization in the Indian context. And she has worked with micro-home solution and NGOs in community development initiatives and in projects aimed at improving housing in informal settlements. And our final speaker will be Isabella Blumm, who is a student in the Masters of Public Policy at the Blavatsky School here at the University of Oxford. She was born and raised in Brazil, and she has more than 9 years experience in the country's public sector. First, she studied sociology at the University of Brasilia. She became a career civil servant as a social policy analyst in 2013, and her main experience is at the Ministry of Health, managing health policies, especially for vulnerable populations. Tamoy and myself are involved with her in the current Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker, which is also based at the Blavatsky School, and she's in a part of a team that is specifically also focused on analyzing Brazil. And so with all of this preliminary information out of the way, I'm really excited to get going. And Jomo, if you take us away, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maurice, and thank you to all for inviting me to participate in this session. I am particularly excited to have an opportunity to revisit a subject which I used to write about briefly, mainly to critically interrogate the use of the term governance. At precisely the time when governments were being came under pressure, particularly from the Bretton Woods institutions and others as well, with the so-called neoliberal counter-revolution against development economics and arguably also Keynesian economics, there emerged this new discourse around governance. So governance and the whole discussion of governance became almost a surrogate, a replacement for addressing the question and of the rights and responsibilities of people in relation to government. This, of course, came at a time when, to some extent, particularly in Latin America, governments were becoming more democratic, and arguably in other parts of the world as well. Today, however, I would like to look at the use. So the book I edited is called Is Good Governance Good for Development? And I basically argue that it is misleading to think that there is any kind of causation between so-called good governance and development. Having said that, however, I think the particular use of the term governance in today's context is slightly different. It accepts, in a sense, the discourse of the World Bank about the fact that in many ways, governance involves much more than government. And I'll accept that for the time being and try to suggest that some of the failures of governance during this COVID-19 period. Of course, later on, when we have a chance to reflect back on this period, we might change our minds about many things. But at this stage, I think it is very important for us to recognize that, that in many ways, the discourse around COVID-19 is partly problematic because of the use of terms and the use of slogans and the use of, for example, the choice often being posed between life and the economy. I think one has to recognize that there are many people who are terribly adversely affected, especially by stay-in-shelter lockdowns, which has been the response in much of the world. But I would like to emphasize that in China, outside of the 3 provinces around Wuhan city, and in much of East Asia, as well as countries like Vietnam and Kerala state in southwest India, we have seen a very different response where we have seen very early action by responsive governments, and that those early actions involving precautionary measures basically succeeded in containing contagion. And this, I think, was extremely important. So contagion was curbed, was contained without resorting to stay-in-shelter lockdowns. And I think that is especially important because stay-in-shelter lockdowns invariably has meant that most people seeking livelihoods, especially in developing countries where there is very little social protection, or social protection has been eroded tremendously in recent years, we see that the question of livelihoods has become extremely important. So stay-in-shelter lockdowns has also been abused. I was initially very taken by the appeal to, say, Rooseveltian type of measures, the emphasis on uniting the country and facing the enemy. The enemy in this particular case being the virus, but the enemy in an earlier context being the enemy from outside. And this, I think, is a rather problematic for at least 2 reasons. The first reason I think it's important to emphasize is that seeing the virus as an enemy has allowed some governments to resort to very authoritarian, despotic measures to deal with the challenge, with the COVID-19 epidemic. This, I think, has been extremely problematic, and there are all too many countries, unfortunately, which have resorted to using rather repressive means to enforce these lockdowns. The other reason why I think it poses a problem is that it deals with the virus as an other, which allows the discourse of rejecting the other, whether it be other countries, other societies, or the other within other people of other colors, and so on and so forth. So it's not a surprise, for example, that many of the health personnel who have succumbed to COVID-19 in the United Kingdom and in some other Western societies have actually been people of color, doctors of color, nurses of color, and other frontline health workers of color. So this, I think, is a particularly problematic issue. Now, coming back to the lockdowns, I think one has to recognize that lockdowns are a measure of last resort, in a sense, after the failure to take adequate precautionary measures. This, I think, seems rather obvious to most people, but unfortunately, all too many people see lockdowns as the only measure which can be taken. And this I find to be the case as not only west of East Asia, which is most of the world, but even in East Asia itself, you find people who talk about lockdown rather lightly, or who make generalizations about the whole of China. In fact, in China, lockdown measures were enforced mainly in Wuhan and the surrounding provinces. It's important for us to recognize that Wuhan has been the industrial hub of China for the better part of the last century, and that many workers in Wuhan were commuters, were daily commuters from the three surrounding provinces. If you think, for example, about New York City as a place of work and people commuting from southern Connecticut, from New Jersey, and so on and so forth to work in New York City, one might get a sense of the kind of commuting which was involved. So because of the geography of the epidemic, the virus spread, and so to not only in Wuhan city itself, but to some of the surrounding feeder communities. Hence, it became necessary to take the lockdown, stay-in-shelter lockdown measures, which were very effectively imposed. Some would even argue harshly imposed in the case of the three provinces around Wuhan. But in the rest of China, there was really no lockdown to speak of. It is true that the normal Lunar New Year holiday, which normally lasts about a week, was extended to 2 weeks this year. But beyond that, there was no stay-in-shelter lockdown for the other more than 20 other provinces of China. This might seem to be a rather obvious to many people in East Asia, but it's something which very few people recognize in the rest of the world. So I think one needs to recognize that, especially in large countries, in continental countries such as India, Brazil, the United States, and so on and so forth, you could actually have tried to contain the epidemic if you had enough information about the geography of the spread of the virus in ways which may not have required a nationwide lockdown. This I think is important. The other reason why I think it's important not to see the lockdown as the only measure, the only option available for governments, is where the argument was most sharply made, and that's the case of the United Kingdom. In the case of the UK, as you all remember, the UK government's view was to try to rely on herd immunity. It was only after the Imperial College of London's first study came out that they made the case that the death toll, the toll in terms of morbidity as well as mortality would be so high that you needed to have you needed to take more measures than simply allowed herd immunity to take its course. And hence you had the imposition of these measures. So this, I think, are some of the immediate concerns which are important for us to consider. Now, many countries have developed and responded to the crisis in different ways. But I think it is important for us to recognize that there has been a high level of effectiveness where information has been shared very effectively. And this is true not only of the East Asian countries I mentioned earlier, it has been true of Vietnam, where information is shared almost at one time on a twice daily basis and now on a daily basis. It has been true of Kerala, where the health minister and the chief minister were giving daily briefings, not only to the press, but beyond the press to whomever was interested. And then through a network of measures, you saw a response which was quite effective. The point I want to make here is that you had an all-of-government approach. In the case of South Korea, for example, they used the new digital technologies very, very effectively, but they also used, for example, they reorganized public transportation. They reorganized the use of classroom spaces. They reorganized, they did cancel many public events, but they were very, very strict in terms of requiring the use of face masks, which were eschewed in other parts of the world for all kinds of reasons, and wrongly eschewed in other parts of the world. So I think the key point I want to make here is that you have an all-of-government approach. It was not simply left to the public health authorities on the one hand and the repressive apparatus of the state on the other hand to enforce stay-in-shelter lockdowns. And related to that, of course, is the whole of society mobilization. Only if you continue to inform and advise the public about what is actually happening, will you be able to get the kind of public understanding and support which is so crucial and so necessary. I think if you think about some of the measures which have been taken, for example, in Argentina, they have gone even further. First, when the government of Argentina, the first Latin American government, by the way, to announce lockdown measures, when they announced the measures, before that they had the health minister, who was no longer a member of the government under the previous government, became a member of the cabinet under the Fernandez government, which was installed in December. And then that government invited the opposition, including the opposition who had been their opponents in the recent election. They invited them, and the entire pantheon of political leadership of the country was there when they announced the lockdown measures. This is a tremendous opportunity for on the one hand, democratic consultation, but also establishing the kind of national kind of effort without resorting to the kinds of repressive measures which unfortunately other governments have resorted to. The other element which is very interesting, and how Argentina has used it for other purposes as well. The second time they had a public announcement was in announcing that because of the COVID-19 crisis, they have to negotiate the debt situation again. So the debt situation has been an outstanding issue in Argentina for about 2 decades, and the last government had basically tried to win over financial markets. Their efforts were very unsuccessful. They allowed vulture capitalists to take advantage of the situation and so on and so forth. This government, the finance minister, as well, and with the president's backing, the president had been a finance minister in a previous government, and mobilized the entire spectrum, including again the opposition, to appear to say that we are in an extraordinary situation, and this is why we need to renegotiate the debt on much more favorable conditions. And this is a time to accept that creditors have an opportunity and should establish international solidarity, should demonstrate international solidarity. And this has, of course, the negotiations will be drawn out and so on and so forth, but this has been extremely successful. So in both, in the case of Argentina as well, you have seen and not only an all of government mobilization and all of the political class, if you will, mobilization, and also accompanying that tremendous mobilization at other levels as well, at least as far as I can read. And it's extremely interesting how they, for example, they deal with Brazilian truck drivers who are bringing over very important provisions which Argentines need, and how they deal with the Brazilian truck drivers who are not subjected to the same conditions which Argentines are. So it's a very, very interesting way, reflecting a great deal of creativity, flexibility, but appropriate policies which are being developed as we speak. I think I've probably run out of time, and let me stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jomo. So much to unpack here. Already a question, we already received our question, but more on the table. Mukta, now it's your turn.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen, but essentially I'm going to sort of take a deep dive into the Indian situation. And I'm a migration scholar. As an architect and urban planner, I've been interested in issues of migration for a while. And when the pandemic happened in India, migrants and their situation sort of came into the limelight, or in a way that hasn't really happened for a very long time. And a lot of things that scholars had been talking about in terms of social welfare, or in terms of just the invisibility of migrants, suddenly became sort of seen in sharp relief at this time. So just to respond to Jomo's point about authoritarian or top-down lockdowns, if you can see, 25th March is when the national lockdown started in India, with only 625 cases and 11 deaths. And we finished the lockdown officially more than a week ago, about 10 days ago. And we've started partial reopening of the economy, but the cases are actually peaking and rising now. So this question of the type of lockdown and the timing of lockdown is being intensely debated in India. But suffice it to say that the Indian government decided to implement the lockdown under an act that gives New Delhi the powers to supersede decisions of its own ministries, but also of state governments. And that sort of, in a democratic country where states like Kerala, as was already mentioned, have or had already been dealing with the virus since late January and through February. And at the end of March, they come under a centralized kind of a lockdown and have to now follow the regulations as passed down by New Delhi. So it sort of created a bit of a center and a federal situation of negotiation and maybe even a little bit of conflict over how this was going to happen. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I just wanted to show you, this is how people on the street experienced the lockdown. The policeman was the central figure who would go around, and because COVID was, the disease spread was also very, very prominent in cities which had density, police going out there asking people to stay home, chasing people back, sometimes even with use of violence. And the unintended, quote unquote, impacts of the lockdown, which actually was implemented with a notice of 4 hours. So leave alone citizens, there is doubt whether even the government was really gave itself time to prepare for a lockdown in a country where over 90% work in the informal economy. So scenes like this, where migrants were walking back to their home villages over long distances, carrying whatever meager belongings they could take with them, or scenes like this in which homeless shelters or community kitchens suddenly saw, several times their usual loads turn up, was really what was confronted in the weeks immediately after the lockdown was implemented. I think it was very stark that a lot of the people who were particularly disadvantaged in this were migrants. And migrants, internal migrants, are a very key part of the workforce in India, almost a third. And if you'd see that they're very important in manufacturing and construction. But the people who were working were short-term and circular migrants, estimated to be up to 100 million. These kind of migrants don't even get very well enumerated in official data sets. They aren't eligible for social welfare if they migrate across the state border. So there are borders within borders here, and state borders then become very important bordering practices for things like social welfare. And of course, they're politically excluded because they vote in their home states, but live in places wherever they get employment. But the curious thing was that the lockdown also pushed long-term migrants to leave, because the extent of the economic shock was so high that even people who had domicile papers for locations where they were working. So for example, an auto driver in Mumbai who would likely have identity papers and address proofs, etc., for Mumbai, also would have left during the lockdown because they simply do not have the safety nets to survive weeks and weeks without an income. So essentially, mobility was not something that the government factored in. Despite the large numbers of working migrants, the government actually hardened its stance on mobility, issuing orders for states to ensure food and shelter for trapped migrants so that they could stay in place, and continuing to take the stand that migrants should remain where they are. And finally, facing pressure from the courts, they start moving migrants back only in the end of May and through June, which actually then ends up in a situation where the arguments about migrants going back carrying the virus really become quite ridiculous, because these migrants who have now lived in cities for 2 months, cities which are hotspots of the coronavirus for 2 months, have now been moved back to the villages, and large numbers of these are testing to the extent that testing is happening, are testing positive or as carriers of COVID. So this has exacerbated the spread of the disease, but it has also exacerbated the specter of long-term labor shortages in cities, and that's where India is right now. I wanted to talk a little bit about the opportunities that we see in this adversity, the kind of conversations that have opened up. And the first one is about the social welfare system. So India's welfare system essentially has some universal components. So for example, education and healthcare is, in theory at least, accessible to everybody, at least in terms of regulatory, the regulatory framework. And then a bunch of location linked ones, which are linked to your address proofs and where you can actually show identities for. And these include the food that could come through the public delivery system, welfare funds that the labor department runs, access to, say, affordable housing or shelters, etc. But the distress during the lockdown actually urged several states to experiment with universalizing PDS. So this was done through eliminating entry barriers. For example, Rajasthan basically said anybody in distress can come and collect their, so much food grain, so much dal, so much oil, etc., to survive, even if they do not have any identification at all, or by really sort of lowering these barriers by using IDs like the Aadhaar, which about 94% of Indians have, regardless of what the address on that identification card was. So this has put the pressure now on devising portable identity systems for mobile workers, and the government's already announced a scheme called the One Nation, One Ration Card. The ration card is actually the identity paper that entitles you to subsidized food and supplies. They've also announced a scheme to develop affordable rental housing complexes, taking cognizance of the fact that migrant workers were actually living in not just in substandard housing, but actually on work sites and on shop floors and in a whole range of situations that were not actually conducive to live in at all. The second one is the potential of decentralized government, and really it's shown how this top-down lockdown actually weakened already the third tier of governance in India, despite constitutional amendments to empower them, are quite weak. Urban local bodies especially are not very well empowered, and states retain a lot of the control in terms of financial planning, in terms of urban planning and land allocation decisions, etc. And the COVID response was under the district, which is sort of an administrative unit, but not under elected governments. So this was also an interesting sort of a lesson to say that it really was hard to have a very contextual response because elected governments were not centrally involved in the disaster response, because the pandemic was framed under this Disaster Management Act and under something called the Epidemic Diseases Act, and seen as a response of disaster and health, without really looking at the pre-existing governance structures and the embeddedness of these governance structures in communities. Even so, we did see that that village communities performed somewhat better, the village councils, as compared to cities, because they have been systematically been empowered over the last, since over the last 25 years. The third, which I really, the comparison to China is quite interesting here, was about hyperlocal responses and embedded civil society. So the kind of, and here again, the analogy of war and sort of an altruistic purpose to serve the nation was evoked by many in order to do relief work, to get food out to people who were vulnerable, who were stuck without livelihoods. And citizen volunteers really became the feet on the ground to do a lot of this. But this local state also, and this is based on my experience in Gurugram as where I live, as a part of the civil society trying to interface with the state actually used resident welfare associations to become their eyes and ears, and actually to force surveillance, control, and negotiating with residents of cities. They tasked they make task forces in which citizens could volunteer on and work. Corporate funding was channelized through government efforts, through state efforts, but also through NGOs. So there's this kind of the embeddedness that civil society already had was leveraged by the local state by the district administrations in order to get relief work done, but also in order to identify, quarantine, keep records, etc. But we see a range of state-society relations here. It's mistrust, it's also interdependence. There are extensions of the state, there's avoidance. A lot of civil society is not comfortable working with the government because preceding the pandemic, there's been a lot of activism around something called the Citizenship Act. And then there's been a lot of tension between the state and civil society overall. So it's interesting how those kind of pre-existing tensions have carried over to this, despite this call for a national, the virus is the enemy and we are at war with the virus, and this use of nationalistic narratives to unite people against the virus. The return of labor to the villages has also sparked a whole debate on the linkages between rural and I'm an urban scholar. I'm also a migration scholar. So this is something that bothers me a lot because there's this debate in migration studies, and I think it's true for all, especially in developing countries, where there's this rural versus urban kind of debate that keeps getting set up. Why can't people stay where they are? Why do they have to come to cities? Poor people should not have to migrate out of distress. So those kind of narratives are now coming up again because, yes, these migrants have left because they could not survive in cities, and cities have treated them quite badly, but there's no work back there's no work in agriculture. Agriculture is already loaded with excess labor. So this sort of debate again is, I think, a push to look at rural-urban linkages, and I'd just like to draw on some of the research. So this is actually how dispersed India's urbanization pattern is. It's not really concentrated in those 8 large metropolitan agglomerations, but spread across a bunch of rural locations where densities have increased and non-farm activity has increased over time in situ. So a lot of people are able to find non-farm work not very far from where they live. And this is from my own research, which is again 2 relatively smaller cities in the Indian context. Their population sizes would send most Western audiences into a tizzy because I'm calling them small, but really to show that they are also hubs for this map basically shows results from our survey, which shows the origin districts of the migrants that we surveyed. And you can see that this small town of 150,000 people is a manufacturing hub, and they have migrants coming from really far. And this town here, Mangalore, has migrants coming from pretty much all over the country. So can they also be migration magnets? And I think the last provocation that I'd like to place is on labor law reforms. There's been a lot of disturbing knee-jerk reactions to this reverse mobility, where states from where migrants go out and there are states in the northern eastern part of India, basically this entire belt, which have traditionally been sending states. So they've always sent migrants out because they're overpopulated, underdeveloped, and they really want to now invite investments and create local employment conditions. There's also been a lot of knee-jerk reactions in terms of relaxing labor laws, and which will worsen the conditions for workers in the interests of hastening an economic recovery. And because of the visibility that migrant workers have received right now, it's now going to be a little harder to ignore this particular segment during the conversation on labor law reforms. And these conversations, the reform of labor laws, has been a major emphasis of the current government, and they're trying to collapse a large number of complicated labor legislation into 4 sort of collapsed, simplified codes. And there's been a lot of debate around that, and it's a very highly politicized issue. But will this be the moment of visibility where migrant workers who have really not found their place in this conversation because they're not usually unionized to be part of, will their concerns now be part of conversations around labor legislation? So those are sort of the few provocations that I had, and I'll leave you there. So essentially,
Thank
social
you very
welfare,
much.
state-society relations, yeah, those are fun. Thanks. Just close.
Thank you for this. Thank you for this incredible insights, Mukta. Now we will travel 10,000 miles to Brazil with Isabella.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this talk. I'm very honored to debate about this very important topic. In a country with the size, the diversity, and the social and economic challenge of Brazil, governance is definitely very complex. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the challenges associated to the governance in Brazil's health system. And in times of pandemic, I will talk a little bit about the intersection of governance in this area with other areas in the government and other sectors of societies as a whole. And I'll also try to bring some lessons as well. First of all, a brief overview about the country to contextualize our health system and governance conditions is that Brazil is the 5th biggest country in the world in area, and also the 5th biggest in population with 210 million people. And even though it is the 9th richest economy in GDP, nominal GDP, it's the 7th in inequality. So in this sense, it is important to emphasize we are talking about governance in a country with very large diversity, regional inequality, very distinct state capability in different cities and states, and different epidemiological features and social determinants in health. In this scenario, we count with a public health system that is universal and free for all citizens, designed in the beverage model and based in the NHS. It is the only country in the world with more than 100 million people to have a universal health system. Due to the size of the country, the governance of the health system is largely decentralized, with federal government, states, and municipalities having specific competencies and a certain level of autonomy. This is an adequate strategy for addressing regional particularities, but can also impose challenge for the implementation of national coordinated actions. During the COVID-19 pandemic, that this challenge arose especially. So right in the beginning of the pandemic, to deal with the crisis, the federal government managed to acquire 5 billion in emergency budget to the Ministry of Health and to hire almost 6,000 doctors to work around the cities against the COVID. And other measures also involved acquiring 500 ICT beds and building emergency hospitals in different regions. But for me, the very challenging and more complex policy, though, was cash transfer program that was developed focused in informal and low-income workers. because this emergency aid, it consists in 600 reais, it's our currency, for worker for 3 months initially, and then it could be extended. Solo mothers would receive double of the amount. As not all of these workers were registered in pre-existing databases that we had, such as the CAD Único, that is like a very good database we have for all those who receive some kind of social security, such as Bolsa Familia. But like in this case, we were including like a broader perspective of workers. So not all of them were in these databases. So the government had to establish decided to establish a self-declaration system that could be done through an app or a website. The coordination of the program is centralized in the federal government, in the Ministry of Economy, and used the state-owned bank for the operations. This model of governance avoided problems like what happened in South Africa, where, for instance, where the local government transferred the budget of emergency aid to local governments, so they would implement the program to the citizens in local level. But this dynamic created large bottlenecks in the delivery of the aid due to low capacity of local governments in rural areas, or even due to corruption. The use of apps and websites by citizens to require the aid aims to avoid agglomerations in the cash request. And it shows that technology can be a great ally in times of COVID-19. But then on the other hand, due to digital exclusion and high inequality in the access to technologies, agglomerations couldn't be avoided in some parts of the country. In some areas, it was highly effective, but in some areas, we still face digital exclusion. Another interesting point about this cash transfer program is that the project was actually designed and presented in the Senate and approved in the National Congress, and not exactly created by the executive government. So, but after the approval in the parliament, the executive branch got the responsibility to implement it. So it's also another example of a complexity of complex democracy implementing a national level program, because it involved the legislative, the judiciary, and the executive actively. It was not only the executive acting to implement the actions. It was actually all the time, like all these big complex stakeholders involved. In terms of governance, it is important to talk about the stringent measures. That is most problematic. That is, for me, in my opinion, the most problematic challenge in the country now. That is exactly what the COVID-19 response tracker from the Blavatnik School of Government was analyzing. When I was contributing to the coding, what became clear about Brazil is that in the beginning, the recommendations were being decided pretty much top down by the Ministry of Health, and most of the states with cases were complying with the measures. However, as it is a topic that involves many other areas, such as economics, social security, security itself, education, among others, as well as large political different perspectives about it. So it became a main focus of disagreement. Bringing a little bit of political science theory, what happens is that Brazil is a democracy with many veto players, which in some sense means that it is a healthy democratic way to balance power. However, it also imposes challenges in the implementation of policies, especially when there is the need of fast coordination and responses in national level, like it is happening now with COVID. So in this sense, implementing stringent measures in the country became especially difficult, as messages from decision makers were distinct and contradictory. Besides, there is also an information war happening in social medias in Brazil, in a very polarized political scenario. So if we take behavioral science, they have pointed that one key issue when delivering a message in times of crisis is avoiding co-founding message and use trust figures to be the message delivered. But the scenario in the country is breaking both rules. About who gives the final answer about stringent measures, after some political battles and disagreement, the Supreme Court had to intervene and gave the final word about it, and decided in May that states and municipalities have the autonomy to decide about their stringent measures, including issues as lockdown, closing shops, public transportation, and school closures, among others. So even though there is a central recommendation from the federal government, there is the autonomy in the local level. And the level of adherence to the stringent measures varies a lot across the country. It is not dependent only on the local state capability to impose them, but also on the social and economic conditions of the territory to keep it sustainable. It's being observed that poorer cities with higher levels of inequalities might face less adherence to the measures due to the harder conditions to sustain it in long term. Therefore, it is important to tackle those in disadvantaged situation with efficient social programs and with the correct message. Bottom-up initiatives in Brazil are a great example of successful innovation in governance for implementing policy recommendations. In the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, for example, community leaders translated government recommendations to the local reality, approaching these citizens with clear language and the necessary adaptations, considering the local lack of infrastructure and proper sanitation. So instead of doing a top-down intervene, the communities actually had like a bottom-up approach that worked pretty well. And one last experience from governance in Brazil that I would like to share concerns information transparency in the middle of the chaos. It is a positive experience in governance and transparency in the country, and that should be a reference for other countries or in other contexts in the country. The Comptroller General of the Union in Brazil launched a website that compiles regularly updated information about scientific findings on the disease, the number of cases, the equipment, ICT beds, occupations, protocols for health professionals, protocols for flights, health campaigns, donations, legislations, and updated with historical base for these legislations, bidding processes, acquisitions, the budget assigned from each agents of the federal government, and the possibility of tracking the budget, etc. It also clarifies measures of other agents like the Central Bank of Brazil, the Ministry of Justice, Education, Foreign Affairs, among others. It is all together in a very clear platform. So instead of you having all these issues of checking different platforms, different websites, and trying to compilate information, we launched this platform that compilates everything in one single platform that is very, very didactic and has a clear language. So even though we had some issues with informations, we also had this very important answer from this Comptroller General agency we have in the country. So I believe this pandemic is a key time for governments to learn with what went wrong and what went right in order to improve governance in long term, in times of pandemic or not. And discussing it like we're doing now is a great opportunity for it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Isabella.